Kursk itself has, it's part of the Russian DNA. I mean, you've mentioned that the first time Russia has been invaded since the Second World War, but the Battle of Kursk, which was the graveyard for hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers, and is so key to the Russian psyche because it was their big sort of defeat of the Nazi Germany. To now see it, almost upturned, people can't believe it, and 200,000 refugees who've been kicked out of their homes, and they've been fed on this diet of Putin being this brilliant military strategist. Now people are realizing that is just not the case. The Russian army is completely stretched. Although they've got 600,000 troops or so in Ukraine along a very long border, they are stretched. Their elite, their professional army was destroyed in the first year of this war. So ostensibly now they have recruits who are poorly trained, poorly motivated, and badly equipped. So the ability to do something like the Ukrainians have done in Kursk is way beyond the Russian rank and file on the front line. I mean, we know that some of the elite forces are kept back in Russia. I mean, we know that Putin has redeployed a lot of air defense assets to protect his palaces and his homes in Sochi and all the rest of it. Now, that's what happens in a dictatorship like Russia. So I think the ability for the Russians to do anything, if they were a really swept up, efficient modern army, they would have had a mobile reserve that would have attacked already. I think that their strategic weapons, their nuclear weapons are unusable. So there is very little they can do. And if moving 5,000 troops on trains and roads, several hundred miles, in the current environment where basically they will be seen by Allied, if not Ukraine intelligence, they can be easily interdicted. So I think people shouldn't be surprised that Russians can't act. I think the other thing is that the chain of command, as we call it, is how military operations are commanded. In the British and American military, we rely on our commanders at the lowest level to make decisions. And if they think they should go left flanking, then that's up to them. Now, that doesn't happen in the Russian military. People are so worried about making mistakes because a mistake in the Russian military generally ends in your demise, that decisions are left to the highest level. So ultimately, we now have Putin making minor tactical decisions, for operations in Kursk. And of course, that takes time. And I expect by the time he's made a decision, the situation has changed again and they're irrelevant. So the Russians have no flexibility and they have no agility. So it's not only their troops are poorly trained, but their decision-making cycle and system is so inflexible that any decision that's made is out of date way before it hits the front line. So when you put all that together, I think people understand why this is such an opportunity for Ukraine to make a difference. And it is the first time in 2.5 years that anything more than a few meters of ground has been taken from either side. And we're now talking about over 100,000 kilometers, the sort of the size of Dorset from where I'm talking to you from.
Yeah, I mean, it is the largest invasion of Russian territory, of course, since the Second World War. I mean, I wanted to get your thoughts, Hamish, on the impact on the Russian psyche and on morale of both Russian troops, but also Russian civilians. As you mentioned, hundreds of thousands of people have been evacuated from the Kursk Oblast, also Belgorod as well. It was interesting, our colleague Matthew Campbell wrote in the Sunday Times over the weekend about his visit to a detention centre in Sumy where Russian prisoners of war were being held. And he wrote about how many of them told him that they were terrified of going there because they'd been fed this propaganda by the Russians about potentially being tortured by the Ukrainian guards. In actual fact, they've been given very good medical treatment. They've been given clean clothing, plenty of food. Some of the Ukrainian guards have gone out and with their own money bought them cigarettes and water and pastries. And that, of course, will have quite a profound effect on those Russian troops. Similarly, you've got a lot of Russian people dissatisfied with Vladimir Putin because they've been forced to leave their homes in Kursk and Belgorod. What do you think the long-term consequences of that will be?
Well, I think it is really interesting that until really the last few days, last week or so, the horrors of the war have been kept from, most Russians, and certainly most of those in Moscow. And it's been a surprise to all of us that, all those political and news shows that we see sort of edited and put out on social media all the time, of how wonderful Putin is and how brilliant the Russian military are. In the last week or so, people are starting to question, what's gone wrong, what's happening, and of course, Kursk itself has, it's part of the Russian DNA. I mean, you've mentioned that the first time Russia has been invaded since the Second World War, but the Battle of Kursk, which was the graveyard for hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers, and is so key to the Russian psyche because it was their big sort of defeat of the Nazi Germany. To now see it, almost upturned, people can't believe it. And 200,000 refugees who've been kicked out of their homes, and they've been fed on this diet of Putin being this brilliant military strategist. Now people have realised that is just not the case. And there's now talk of another mobilisation. Hitherto, the Russian army has been pretty much full of ethnic Russians from the east. And prisoners. I mean, there's some prisoners who've been in and out of jail so often and back to the front. If it wasn't so flipping terrible, it would be comical. And the thought now, the last time they had a mobilization just after the start of the war, hundreds of, or not tens of thousands of Russian men, fled the country. So that's why I think, Russia is in a really difficult position, as far as we're concerned, a good position. I think Putin is absolutely rattled and clinging on, and people who don't really understand these things will be saying, oh, well, whoever replaces him is going to be much worse. Well, he might be, but he's not going to have an army to threaten, NATO for the next 10 years or so. So why should we worry about that? Which is why it's so important that absolutely, we stop rabbit punching around and get in for the killer blow, which is why, the British Storm Shadow is so important. It might only be one missile, but it has a strategic impact. And I hope that Sir Keir Starmer and his team are getting to understand that and are being briefed on that particular thing. So, yeah, I think the Russian army is absolutely stretched to the limits. People in Russia are beginning to realize the myth of the great leader is a complete myth, and realize that they are absolutely suffering. And exactly as you say, Russian soldiers are getting looked after rather than the other way around, where they're getting starved. And there's some horrific pictures of Ukrainian soldiers being beheaded by their captors and their heads put on stakes. Now, whether that might well be propaganda, but that is the feeling that one gets. So anything we can do to personify that and make sure that people in Russia understand it, the better, because ultimately everybody wants peace as soon as possible. Slim's great adage that you attack the enemy as quick as you can, as hard as you can, when he's not expecting it and where it really hurts, is exactly what they've done. And the ability to maneuver, if you can maneuver quickly and effectively, a much smaller force can defeat a much larger force. What Slim did back in Burma in 1943. Now we know that Russia vastly in numbers overmatches anything Ukraine's got. There's 600,000 Russian troops in Ukraine, but a lot of them are very poorly trained and really can only do static operations in trenches. The Russians have lost, upwards of 4,000 tanks and thousands of other armoured vehicles, and have not been able to train their crews to effectively fight in any new ones they can produce. So they're very static. And it's one can think of many analogies, but if you can move around very quickly, but others can't, you can get behind them, which is exactly what Ukraine's done, and defeat them. So I think the strategic or combined arms maneuver warfare that a lot of people like me have been talking about and other people have been questioning, it gave the advantage in the First World War. It certainly gave the advantage in the Second World War. You think of the Nazis' Blitzkrieg, Rommel's Blitzkrieg in 1939 and 40, which completely devastated a pretty static Allied defence. But then when we move forward to the Allied landings of 1944 and beyond, again, it was the ability to move rapidly with combined arms maneuver warfare that won the game. And the war in Ukraine has been static for at least 2 years now. So those people who can maneuver and get behind your enemy and turn them will be successful. And although this is, a very small incursion, actually, the noise it's having in the Kremlin is massive, because, we are now, I think, 14 days into this incursion, and the Russians still haven't counterattacked. From a military perspective, I mean, that is the biggest crime you can achieve. Every doctrine handbook that we have, the Americans have, the French have, the Russians have, the number one thing says if you lose any ground, you counterattack immediately. The Russians haven't been able to do that, which is why I think it's so significant, because actually I don't think they can. The Ukrainians have blown a whole bunch of bridges, and we'll come and talk about Storm Shadow and some of the British strategic weapons in a minute. Ukraine has victory in its hands, as it were, in this area, and it's absolutely key that we don't snatch that victory from them by some of the decisions that our leaders might be making today, tomorrow, and in the next few weeks.
Your latest Substack piece is a fascinating look at the perilous position Vladimir Putin currently finds himself in. And what's really interesting is the growing dissent inside Russia. Can you just expand a bit on that and what some of the people have been saying?
Well, this is unique again. I think it's because Ukraine has turned the tables and it's now attacking Russia. It's attacking Russia inside Russia. It's grabbed a chunk of Russia by occupying it. It's got a nuclear plant. It's got prisoners of war. It's being aggressive in return. It's no longer content with being a punching bag. And the further they go in their incursion, it makes it possible for them to get over any restrictions on using weapons in a long range, because they're closer to the target. So they can use the short range weapons that they're allowed to use and not use the long range that some of the Americans and others have forbidden them from using, by just moving their missile launchers inside Russia closer to the targets. They're also swamping Moscow as well as Crimea with drone attacks. And so all of this has happened, and this has happened in the last week or so. And this has psychologically turned the tables inside Russia, and I think internationally, because, the ruble is cratering, and there are some very prominent Russians who are now speaking out against this war and against Putin, very unusually. So there's a level of, it's an enormous shift, I think, inside Russia.
I mean, what does that tell us about the weakness of Putin's position? Because famously, he does not tolerate dissent. Does the fact that you've now got people coming out feeling more free to criticize the regime in the Kremlin, does that show that maybe Putin's position is severely undermined now?
Well, I'm not sure that they feel more free. I think they're very upset and they can't stand it any longer. And they're doing it regardless. So the latest one is another militia mercenary head, and he's come out on video just as Prigozhin. Do we all remember Prigozhin last year? He came out criticizing Putin and the war, asked for an end to the war. His mercenaries were in there fighting, as are this guy's. And of course, he staged a very brief mutiny and was eventually assassinated. Despite that, another guy has come forward publicly, very courageously. And, you got to remember that they have a military in the government of Russia, but there are hundreds of private militias like Prigozhin had that are owned by oligarchs. And so they could get together and he's demanding that the army overthrow Putin. That's what he's saying, overthrow him. He's also talking about the enormous social problems that this has caused for Russian people. I mean, he's obviously setting himself up. He wants a coup. He wants a coup d'etat. And then there's another prominent oligarch who's also publicly come out very strongly against the war and also calling for it to end. And he's probably backed by other oligarchs. So what you're seeing, and then there's a third fellow who's a very important inner circle guy who's been demoted because he said a few things. He hasn't come out in favor of overthrowing Putin, but he's created problems for Putin. So Putin still remains a dictator. It still would require an army mutiny or a coup d'etat by the military to probably get rid of him, unless he feels forced or is forced physically to leave. It's a big development.
I mean, I don't know. To me, it seems hard to imagine Putin voluntarily leaving power, because he will think he is safest in power, surely.
Well, maybe he will find out that he isn't, and he has children and a family, and there's a lot of very violent people in Russia, and many of whom work for him. And we've seen in the past that if you're a dictator and you have any slippage, you're surrounded by ruthless people. They'll get rid of you just as you got rid of them if they were wrong stepping. So, he can't be all that secure. I think another thing that's interesting psychologically is that the Ukrainians about 3 weeks ago leaked the fact that they had the ability to assassinate Putin at a big naval parade in a certain city in Russia, went to the Pentagon to ask for permission because they needed to use American weaponry, were refused, okay? What that means is it was disappointing for many people, I guess, but the point is that by leaking it, they made it very clear to Mr. Putin, they'll get him if they can. And they were only prevented from getting that. He's vulnerable. He's not invincible. So psychologically, his strength is being sapped.
Yeah, and we know, for instance, in recent weeks, he's transferred air defenses from the front line in Ukraine to protect the Kremlin, but also his home in Sochi as well. So clearly he is feeling nervous. There's understandably, Diane, been a lot of focus on the humiliation of the incursion into Kursk and the evacuation of people from Belgorod. I mean, this is the largest invasion of Russia since the Second World War. It is a humiliating moment. But there hasn't been so much discussion, but you touch on this very interestingly in your Substack piece about the falling value of the ruble. How significant do you think that is?
Well, I think that the Kursk invasion is now getting disseminated to the world community. That it looked like just a little deal. Were they going to get a nuclear plant? What does it mean? What are they doing it for? They're much smaller army. They can't possibly outlast the Russians. But now, as it disseminates, you see that the magical thing about it is that those people, as you alluded to, who were evacuated, those Russians, 80 villages, and then 80 more probably in Belgorod. Putin can control the state media around this incursion, but he can't stop the people in Belgorod and Kursk who are being evacuated and frightened from calling their relatives and telling them what's going on and asking if they can have a spare bedroom to sleep in. I mean, this is spreading through that society very quickly, and so is the fear. And we're also seeing some state media companies quoting or allowing people to speak out. So I'm optimistic that eventually this guy has done a war that's not helped his country, that's damaging his economy. Look, the Kursk raid shows that Ukraine still has game. It also shows because the invasion in Kursk was done with German, American, and NATO tanks. So they've got backing. The Germans are coming out. The President Steinmeier said yesterday, when there were rumors they may cut their military to aid to Ukraine, no, we are going to be and remain Ukraine's biggest aid giver for the military. So the tide is turning. Has it turned for the best for a long time? I don't know. And then there's, of course, the whole mess in Crimea.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to come back to the response from Ukraine's Western allies in just a moment. You highlight in your Substack, Diana, a piece by Mark Galeotti in The Times recently, in which he points out that Russia's military failure also upsets ordinary Russians because it exposes the regime's corruption and cronyism. Can you just expand a bit on that?
Well, apparently the actual place where they breached the border in Kursk, the Ukrainians breached the border, the the Russian government had allocated and contracted out, I think, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of dragon's teeth, trenches, minefield, whatever, to impede any possible invasion. And the Ukrainians in 24 hours, and they had troops there, in 24 hours, the Ukrainians with German and American and British tanks blew right through that fortification. And there was only one way that could have happened, because they probably didn't do the work, they pocketed the money.
So turning to the Western response, do you think we will see what Ukraine is clearly calling for, which is to be allowed to use Western-supplied weapons to strike military targets inside Russia? The West has loosened some of those restrictions over recent months, but not to the extent that Ukraine wants. There is an argument that by invading Kursk, it has shown once and for all that Putin's red lines are just a bluff. But clearly the West has always been cautious about potential escalation. Do you think we will see movement on that front?
Well, I think that, this incursion also, as you say, made mockery of his red lines, also made mockery of his nuclear Armageddon bluffs. They just went ahead. Made mockery of, threatening Germany and NATO. They were part of it. And so, the king kind of has no clothes. And I think that's also very undermining for Putin. I hope it is. And I think all of that is given wind behind the back of the NATO allies. And that's why you see Germany, Steinmeier says, yes, we're going to remain the biggest, contributor to military aid, which they are, to aid of all kinds, to Ukraine going forward. So the Germans are finally starting to get it. And then you see some other movement that I talk about. You see this cancellation of the big gas pipeline by Mongolia to China. I think that's kind of significant. It happened just a few days after this. So these kinds of things point to a very grim economic future for Russia, and that's why the ruble's collapsing. It's probably also collapsing if Russian oligarchs and other players are getting out of the ruble quickly, because they face either a coup d'etat or continued weakening of the country.
All over the place at the moment. I think he's really embarrassed. He's confused. He's hoping that he can provide a definitive answer to this, but there isn't an easy answer. The obvious solution for Russia would be to send a massive military force to just drive the Ukrainians out of the region straight away. But he doesn't have the manpower quickly available. They're sending conscripts, which of course is causing a certain reaction inside Russia, a very unfavorable reaction. And I think Putin is both furious and embarrassed. Furious with his own generals and chiefs of staff who haven't prepared for this, who haven't secured the borders, and embarrassed because it does look as though Russia is vulnerable, something that he's always said Russia is secure and firm and can, look after its own defense. And that clearly doesn't seem to be the message that's come out.
And in terms of the choices he's now faced with, I mean, all of them carry political problems. He can divert troops from the front line in the east of Ukraine, but clearly that's not ideal. He can use conscripts, but again, that comes with political costs. Or he could launch a fresh wave of mobilisation, but again, politically very risky.
Exactly. You said exactly the three things that are very difficult for him, and those are really the only three options. His favoured response would be a massive military counterstrike to really hit the Ukrainians hard and push them straight out again. That's probably what the Ukrainians themselves have been expecting, and they're probably ready to withdraw quickly if needed, partly to save their own manpower and partly to secure their position as a force that could strike back, but are not there to occupy territory, but to show the Russians that they're vulnerable. But the other one, as you say, conscripts, well, they are already, it seems, sending some conscripts into the region, and that's caused a massive reaction. The mothers of Russia, who up to now have been surprisingly quiet, have begun to say, look, this is not what we were told. Our sons and our young ones are not there to be on the front line, and this is the front line. Well, it is now. And the final thing, which is to bang the patriotic drum and get everyone going together, doesn't seem to be working because there's a lot of surprisingly open criticism in the Russian media of this blunder, the fact that Russia was unprepared, they didn't see it coming, and that they haven't really had proper border reinforcements.
It's easy to be wise after the event, because had you told either of us 3 weeks ago, oh, by the way, Ukraine's about to invade Russia, we probably would have, discounted it. But should the Russians, in hindsight, have seen this coming? Should they have expected this could happen?
Probably not, because they felt the Ukrainians were on the back foot, and to some extent they still are. They just don't seem able to have the manpower or the resources, and in particular the weapons, to stop the steady thrust by Russia across this big, broad front all along eastern Ukraine. And the Ukrainians, little by little, have been ceding ground, have been giving up villages, have lost strong points. And the Russians, I think, felt that they've got Ukraine on the run. Maybe not straight away, and maybe there are some setbacks, but in the end, the inevitable result is that Ukraine will be pushed further and further back from the front line. What they didn't anticipate is that Ukraine would be able to gather together and mobilize a strike force which would be diverted to some region not where the Russians are pushing forward, but up north, further north in the Kursk region, and that they would suddenly spring on a surprise on the Russians, which is exactly what they have done. And I think, yes, of course, they will be blamed for bad intelligence, bad defense, but to be fair to them, I don't think they could have seen this coming.
You made a really interesting point a moment ago, Michael, about some of the reaction inside Russia, including in the Russian media, that, of course, is so controlled by the Kremlin to a large extent, but has been critical in recent weeks. To what extent will people inside Russia even be aware of the full extent of what's happening in the Kursk region? I mean, clearly it is an informational autocracy. If you're living in Kursk, if you're living in Belgorod Oblast, which has been evacuated, you'll be aware of it. But if you're an ordinary Russian in Moscow, St. Petersburg, or one of the other cities or towns, how aware are you?
Well, not very aware officially, because, as you say, there's been a clampdown, and Putin himself has barely commented on this at all. He's been invisible, except that he's done a few walkabouts just recently. And as somebody remarked, only when Putin is under pressure does he go on walkabouts and try to show himself as a real leader, liked by the people, popular, shaking hands, all that sort of thing. Normally he's much more remote, much more secluded, and he hasn't really said much about this. Possibly a sign of embarrassment because he doesn't quite know what he should say. But the fact that there has been a sort of information blackout, it's not a complete blackout, but it's certainly not much detail of what the Ukrainians have gained in the region. That can be undermined by all these people who've fled, who all have relatives all over Russia, or probably many of them do, and word has got back by word of mouth, which is the normal way. People have said, do you know what's happening down there? Let me tell you, my uncle has just told me this and this and this, or whatever it is, and word spreads pretty quickly. So I think a lot of Russians are quite aware of exactly the danger that they've now face and the problem of having lost territory for the first time since the Second World War.
Which is a huge humiliation. I mean, it does seem not like a deliberate tactic now by the Ukrainians to bring the war quite literally to Russia, not only in terms of this incursion, but also the drone attacks that we've seen on Moscow, and also the fact, you've got Telegram down, you've got WhatsApp down. If you're living in Russia, it's becoming more apparent that all is not well.
I think that's absolutely clear, yes. I mean, the drone attacks on Moscow probably don't inflict much damage. It's clearly demoralizing to think that from far away, from, 1,000 miles away or whatever it is, they are still able to send something over to cause damage in the capital, which up till now has felt pretty safe. I mean, there have been one or two sporadic attacks up till now. I think that's probably, in terms of Ukrainian tactics, a little bit dubious. It will certainly cause doubts among Ukraine's Western supporters. They've told the Ukrainians, look, we're not here to back an all-out war. We don't want you targeting Moscow or any other big population centers. We are ready to go along with strikes on Russian military establishments, particularly in the border regions, which have happened and where they've used drones to some good effect. But I think the drone attacks, well, they're intended not really to cause damage, but to demoralize Russia and to embarrass the Russian leadership, and they probably have done that. But I think much more the embarrassment is losing territory. I mean, that is the real key thing. That's never happened before, and that certainly is something that the Russians will feel both angry about and probably ashamed.
We've spoken about Putin being pretty paralysed at the moment, but what do you think he will decide to do in the end, Michael?
I think if possible, he would decide on a massive military counterstrike. I think he will be preparing a force that will go straight in enormous numbers and with overwhelming force and weapons. And at the same time, he will probably prepare a huge drone or missile or bombing attack on big cities in Ukraine. I mean, Kharkiv has already been under attack. Kiev comes under regular attack, but I think these will be redoubled, and he will go for the infrastructure, which they've been doing already, trying to knock out all their energy networks and things of that kind. And it will really, the aim is to make it as difficult and uncomfortable for Ukraine as possible, and if possible, cut off their lines of communication to the Kursk region.
How secure do you think his position is at the moment?
Hard to tell. I mean, everybody says, well, this must be embarrassing for him, and I'm sure there are rumblings and this, that, and the other. Who knows? I mean, he's been very much in charge throughout the entire Ukraine war. The attempted rebellion by Prigozhin, the Wagner group, I mean, that was pretty quickly snuffed out and fairly brutally with the guy, assassinated on a plane, clearly brought down by a bomb of some kind. And challenges to Putin are certainly not visible. He is secure in that he's got virtually everybody on his side, or at least the army depends on him. He's been pretty critical of the leadership of the army and various others, and those who failed have been dismissed, some of those who failed. It's hard to see where any challenge to his own power would come from. It's not possible politically to oust Putin. Funnily enough, it was much easier to get rid of a Soviet leader because in the Politburo, all you had to do was to outvote the leader. And that's what happened to Khrushchev. And he was dumped, he was voted out. There's no way of getting rid of Putin constitutionally except by impeachment in the parliament. And of course, with a tame parliament like that, it's never going to happen. The only way of getting rid of him is by a coup d'etat. And that would have to be with the cooperation of the army and the intelligence services and whatever other agencies around could be mobilized to strike against him. And it doesn't look as though that's likely.
Do you think his wider strategy is still to wait until November, to wait until the US election and hope for a second Trump presidency?
Oh, I think that's definitely a factor, yes. I mean, whether a Trump presidency is as guaranteed now as it was 3 months ago is open to question. But I think he does think or feel that the Trump administration, a new one, would be much more indulgent of what Russia is doing. I mean, Trump himself boasted, I'll end this in a few days or so. In other words, I'll just say to Russia, you take what you want. That's the end of it. We'll just tell Ukraine, that's it. No more weapons. You're on your own. Make a deal, which in that circumstance would be a very disadvantageous deal. And I think Putin feels all he has to do is to wait and see. Now, if Trump doesn't win, does he then feel under pressure to make a deal? Or will the Chinese, who are the only ones who could actually push Russia one way or the other, do they think that that would be the time that they would step in and say it's time to actually end this war or not? We really don't know. I don't think there's going to be any movement by Putin, certainly for the next few months.
It's really interesting what you say about the Chinese there. Do you think that Xi Jinping is pretty much the only person on the planet who has the power to pick up the phone to Putin and say, call it off?
Absolutely, yes. Nobody else could. I mean, one or two think that they could be peacemakers. The Turks think, Erdogan thinks that he is in a position to get Putin to agree to some kind of deal, and Turkey could intervene with a proposal for a non-intervention or, ceasefire or whatever it might be. The Turks negotiated a minor deal in the past. They were the intermediaries over the decision to allow Ukraine to export its grain through the Black Sea without being interrupted. But that was a pretty minor deal, and I think the Russians didn't feel they were losing much by it. But in terms of actually ending the war, yes, the Chinese are the only people who have real influence over Moscow. And it depends how they see it, whether they think that having the war as an embarrassment for the West is more worth it than ending what they see as potentially destabilizing conflict that could cost China quite a lot in terms of secondary Western boycotts of their own trade, which they didn't want, they won't want. We'll see. But certainly they are the only ones in a position to pick up the phone and say, time to declare victory and end it.
Let's talk about the Ukrainian side of things. What is your sense of what Ukraine's primary objective is? I mean, increasingly I'm of the view that maybe it's actually designed to send a message to Ukraine's Western allies to go, look, we can cross Putin's so-called red lines and we can prove he's bluffing because he hasn't responded with tactical nuclear weapons or the worst-case scenario.
I think you're right. Yes, it certainly is a message to the West. We are not finished. You know, we may have been slowly retreating along the whole of the Eastern Front, but look, we have initiative, we have capability, and we can spring surprises, and we can inflict a serious military and political setback on Russia. And also that we are ready to hold territory as a bargaining chip. I mean, they made it quite clear this is not a long-term objective. They're not trying to occupy Russian territory. And as you say, they are to some extent calling Russia's bluff, because the Russians have said several times, including former President Medvedev, who said that any incursion onto vital Russian interests, including Russian territory, would incur the strongest possible response. In other words, tactical nuclear response. Well, that's not happened, and we hope is not going to happen. So Ukraine is performing useful service in showing up what appear to be bluffs. But the danger of that is it may not be a bluff. You know, there may be a Russian counter-response, and it could be pretty devastating. We don't know. So I think the West is wise to be cautious, but at the same time, it's also being pushed by Ukraine to say, we're not finished yet, give us the weapons and we will succeed.
So I wanted to first of all get your thoughts on what we've seen in the past 24 hours or so, which is this pretty major drone attack on Moscow. What is your analysis of it?
Well, there have been drone attacks before on Moscow, so it's the scale of this one which is slightly different. I'm not quite sure if one or two of the 11 got through. What it plays into really is this abundant and accumulating vulnerability which we see to Russia. It's worth saying, of course, that it's not the first time, and it's the range really, because although there's a restriction on the use of certain NATO weapons, we need to remind ourselves that on the 25th of July, for example, Ukrainian drones struck Elenya airfield in the Murmansk region when a number of backfire bombers were hit. That is 1,800 kilometers from the front line. And Moscow is something like, in a direct line, if you're flying there, 841 kilometers. So that is well beyond the reach of, for example, the HIMARS rockets. So what it really shows us is that Ukraine are producing their own drones. They can be successful. And what you do after these attacks, be they failed or otherwise, is you do a battlefield damage assessment and a thing we call the measurement of effectiveness assessment, which is why did it potentially fail? What routes can we use in the future? What height do we fly at, for example? And how can we make it better so that we succeed? So, Moscow would argue that the layered defense worked, and it probably did, but flights were cancelled at various Moscow airports. And it is that, as I said, this accumulating vulnerability with the fact that Moscow can be hit, there's an incursion in Kursk, all these things with population fleeing can play into this fact of the psychological aspect of war, which I often bang on about, because people just look at things in a physical sense, but it's the collapse of will or the contribution to the collapse of will that is ultimately the key thing in war. Now, you have to be slightly careful because we see a partial view of the war, and two of the key things about being an analyst is you've got to be very careful that you're not adopting optimism bias and availability bias, but of the things that you see.
I mean, that's a really good point, but your sense is this plays into the wider Ukrainian tactic of taking the war to Russia in the same way we're seeing in the Kursk region with the incursion, and now we're seeing it in Moscow with this large-scale drone attack.
Well, in terms of their deep battle, I think it now shows that there are three types of targets. The first one are the oil refineries, and we have heard some talk in the last week, we don't know if it's true or not, that there was going to be some sort of you don't strike ours and we don't strike yours in terms of oil refineries or electricity generation in Ukraine. So the oil refineries attacks, deep battle attacks by the Ukrainians are working, I think. And we see this by the fact that, again, from the 1st of September to the 31st of December, there's going to be a further ban on gasoline exports from Russia. So the oil refineries is the first deep battle target. The second one, which the Kursk incursion helps with, is the airfields. So, trying to knock out the airfields in the west of Russia, which host the aircraft which are targeting Ukrainian cities. And that is why, for example, that airfield, the Olenya airfield in Murmansk, was attacked on the 25th of July. And the third one is, Moscow is the capital city, and therefore it's iconic. If you infuse that vulnerability there, then that is going to have an impact at some stage. Now, that doesn't mean that, I've often said that there's an eroding stalemate. It's pretty slow erosion at the moment. Some stage there is likely to be a landslide. It's very, very difficult to see when that landslide will be. What I would say about the Kursk operation from a political level at the moment for Putin is that, of course, they've not defined it as a military operation from their perspective. The FSB has the lead. It's been deemed a counter-terrorist operation. And that is deliberate because it therefore is not deemed to be a state of war, and martial law has not been declared. And at the moment, that should prevent any blowback on Putin until you have either mass casualties or other things that occur, which could happen again in a sort of micro sense of what is happening in Kursk at the moment.
I just want to pick up on what you just said there about a landslide. By that, do you mean a decisive shift in momentum at some point during this war? And do you think we're close to that?
It's very, very difficult to say that. What you can say, again, from an historical perspective, for example, is that in this same period of time in 1918, at the end of the Battle of Amiens, the Allies went 7 miles in a week, and that was deemed to be the black day for the German army. No Allied troops ever were in Germany in the First World War. So to say from when you go to an eroding position to a landslide is very, very difficult to measure. I've often said that there are 3 variables here that we look at. Firstly, are the population fed up and therefore want a change in their political polity? And I think one of the interesting things about the Kursk incursion has been how benign the Russian population have been. They just don't seem to be that bothered by the Ukrainian incursion. Neither do they seem to be up in arms about Putin. Now, if they haven't got services, then that might come to fruition. And one of the things that the Ukrainians might be trying to do is to make sure that there's no electricity passing across that region to Belgorod. And therefore, if you've got no electricity in that region and the lights go black or the lights go out, that can have an impact on the people. And I think the interesting thing from the Kursk thing, again, this plays into the fact that it's deemed a CT operation, and the fact that it's in Russian territory means that conscripts can be used, because although they can't be used abroad, they can be used in Russian territory. Now, the conscripts, should they be used, are pretty badly trained. And if you have a large number of body bags occurring, then you do get into this aspect of potentially the mothers of Russia kicking off, which happened, of course, in the Afghanistan war. But the will to challenge the regime from the population and the mothers has not been there at the moment. There's been no divide and rule there. So let's take the population aside from that one. The second thing we always say is that the army might revolt, as they did in the First World War, which led to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, of course. We're not really seeing that at the moment. Could be again, because you will see, I think, when we get on to the tactics of Kursk, that there's going to be more bad news for Russia. And the third aspect, of course, is if the political polity or the elites defect around Putin. But at the moment, the elites aren't defecting around him. They stayed with him largely after the Prigozhin sort of march on Moscow, and most of them are culpable in the war anyway. So everything at the moment looks manageable from a Russian perspective as we stand on the 18th day of this incursion. What, from a military perspective, is unusual is that although Ukraine achieved surprise, which we always say can have a force multiplier of 3 times its worth in combat terms, that surprise normally dissipates between 1 to 3 days. Here we are on day 16, and they still seem to be going forward, and that surprise has not decayed. So that's unusual. So the Russian response has not been vigorous as you think it might be or should be.
Yeah, I want to come back to the situation on the ground in Kursk in a moment. I mean, just on that point about the threats to Putin's position, on Times Radio earlier on, we spoke to Sean Bell, military analyst and former fighter pilot, and he was saying that he thinks actually Putin is vulnerable potentially to a kind of palace coup from oligarchs. And I hear what you say, Chip, that there's no sign of it at the moment. But I suppose if you are in the political elites around Putin in Russia, you don't show your hand. I mean, to do so would put you in mortal danger. So some of these conversations will be happening on a very low level, in very hushed voices in the corridors of power. Do you think we might be closer to that than we've been for some time?
No. So to answer the question, is Putin weakened? You would say no if you believe, as I do at the moment, the entire Siloviki, the military political establishment, is complicit in the war. To answer Sean's point about yes, that would be he is vulnerable because you're not seeing a great patriotic swelling of patriotism after the incursion into Kursk, or because he may have lost his image as Russia's protector because the Ukrainians are in Kursk. But because it's a marginal region from a Russian perspective, he can overcome that because he still thinks that he holds the strategic whip hand in terms of a long war where the West will get fed up with it, and therefore he will be able to have the terms that he wants for some sort of future negotiations. I think that's also dangerous for him at the moment, though, because one of the notions of peace has always been a frozen peace. Well, frozen peace when you've got Ukrainian troops on your soil doesn't look any good. And of course, the Chinese, for example, the Chinese peace plan, which came out in February 23, the first anniversary of the war, did talk about a demilitarized zone up to the Dnieper, i.e., all the way through the sort of Donetsk region, and from a Chinese perspective, incorporating Zaporizhia and Kherson. Now, we can now potentially reverse that and say, hang on, let's have a DMZ, demilitarized zone, on the Russian side of the border, because this isn't necessarily the end of the operation from a Ukrainian perspective. One of the things I think is interesting is I'm not sure if the Russians think that this is just a feint in the same way that the Germans thought that Normandy wasn't the main effort for the Allies in June 44. So they might be expecting something else somewhere else. That could be another incursion in Belgorod. It could be a move down through Zaporizhia. Could be through Kherson. And it's that keeping the enemy on the horns of a dilemma, which is the key thing in terms of the future of how the Ukrainians develop this operation in Kursk, or something that goes with the operation in Kursk. So Putin is not vulnerable at the moment, and that would be overplaying the mark severely.
Here we are 2 weeks into Ukraine's incursion into the Kursk region of Russia. What is your assessment of how it's going at the moment?
Well, it's certainly going a lot better than almost anybody would have expected from the Ukrainian side. I think the Ukrainians were confident that Russia had porous and vulnerable borders on its western flank because of the ease in which partisans from the Russian Volunteer Corps in May of 2023 were able to cross those borders, the ease by which similar kinds of partisans were able to cross into Belgorod and Kursk earlier this year, and perhaps most dramatically, how rapid Yevgeny Prigozhin's Wagner Group forces were able to take over the military headquarters in Rostov-on-Don and march to within 200 miles of Moscow. But obviously, the fact that the Ukrainians have a military administration being set up in Kursk less than 2 weeks into their offensive is something that I think nobody could have anticipated.
It's a really good point you raise about Prigozhin, because it simultaneously feels quite recent, but also feels a long time ago in that weird way that the time plays that trick on us. And I suppose what it reminds us of is there was so much conversation in the wake of the Prigozhin mutiny of the vulnerability of Putin's position. But so far this year, because Russia's been on the front foot in the east of Ukraine and has been making incremental gains, a lot of that conversation had died down until now. But now we're being reminded of some of the fundamental weaknesses of Putin's position.
Exactly. I think that Putin's position never really durably strengthened, I think, after the takeover of Yevgeny Prigozhin's failed mutiny. I think that what happened was Putin's Russia decided to use repression against Russian ultranationalists, which is not a tactic that it had used in the past. Ultranationalist forces throughout Russian history have historically been a thorn on the side of the ruling elites. During the First World War, it was the law of Russian ultranationalist forces who resisted any kind of compromise with Germany, who wanted more of a total war, who believed the Tsar Nicholas II was not really fighting the war more strongly enough. They carried out the 1993 constitutional crisis against Boris Yeltsin. They even, from some members of the Bolshevik Party, even occupied buildings in the early 2000s. So, but Putin opted in the mid 2000s to co-opt those groups, to bring in and empower figures like Ramzan Kadyrov, Petro Kirill from the Orthodox Church, Yevgeny Prigozhin, Sergei Glaziev as economic advisor, and Dmitry Rogozin as ambassador to NATO. And but by the time the Ukraine war came around, their criticisms became so sharp that they were discrediting and undermining his authority and that of the Russian Ministry of Defense and the Russian military. And after the mutiny, he chose to repress them. That's why he arrested Gurkin. That's why Prigozhin got assassinated. That's why Surovikin got dismissed. That's why a whole host of these developments took place. But that unrest is not going to go away. I mean, there was actually sizable numbers of criticisms on Russian Telegram of the slow pace of Russia's war effort, warnings about the lack of fortifications and defense on Russia's borders, even before what we saw in Kursk. And now that mistrust in the military and the political establishment is starting to resurface and bubble up again. Because 150 years of history of Russian ultranationalists being a thorn on the side in the Kremlin is not going to go away just because you shoot down Prigozhin's plant.
I mean, that's a really good point. I want to come on to some of the specifics about the incursion in a moment, but just from the kind of the Kremlinology side of it, I mean, what do you think the conversation would have been like a couple of weeks ago when presumably one of Putin's military advisors approached President Putin, told him, by the way, Ukraine have crossed the border into the Kursk region, that they're managing to hold some territory? What would have been going through his head when he heard that?
Well, exactly. That's what we've been seeing from some of the latest reporting, that these discussions were happening about 2 weeks before the Kursk incursion began. The very idea that the Ukrainians could take substantial amounts of Russian territory and hold it for a period of time. But I think that there was collective skepticism and disbelief within the Russian Ministry of Defense and within the FSB, and also the old tendency recirculating again. Nobody in the FSB, nobody in the Ministry of Defense wants to be the person to be the bearer of bad news to Putin, because if you bear bad news to the Russian news czar, it doesn't really end very well for you. So I think that historical dishonesty within the system is something that's really come to the fore right now, and it's undermined Russia's preparations, and it's really exposed the Russian Ministry of Defense to be inept and incompetent. The very fact that Valery Gerasimov, just 2 days into the incursion, said that it was not only contained, but the 300 Ukrainian forces that had entered Kursk were dead, I think is a sign that nobody really believes or has any trust, if they had anything left at all, in what's coming from the messaging from the Russian military. And the problem is it doesn't allow Putin and it doesn't allow his inner circle to respond effectively to changes on the ground.
I mean, this is always the danger of leading an autocratic regime. You know, when you use propaganda as a tool, you start to wonder at what point does the leader believe their own propaganda? At what point do they become high on their own supply? And do you think that's the situation Putin is in at the moment?
Well, I think that's been the situation that Putin's been in even before this full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I think that basically they bought into the notion that about 25 or 30% of Ukrainians before the war were going to, because they were ethnic Russian, because they spoke Russian, were going to be greeting the Russians as liberators, so that the Russians would have no problem taking over large swathes of Kherson, Zaporizhia, as well as the remainders of Donetsk and Luhansk, and possibly even push for Kharkiv and Odessa. And Putin is in a circle believed that, even though in 2014 they realized that when the Russian deniable forces went into Donetsk, ethnic Russians in Ukraine, Russian speakers in Ukraine, took up arms and fought for the Ukrainian army. But they didn't necessarily remember that experience 8 years later, because the propaganda was so intense that they believed that these people were going to rise up. And that's been the chronic mistake and the chronic blind spot that the Kremlin has had pretty much ever since then. I don't think the Russians really believe that the Ukrainians were able to launch an effective offensive operation. That's why when the Ukrainians started launching a counteroffensive in the summer of 2022 in Kherson and Kharkiv, they basically in the early days said that it was going to be failing, it was going to be rebuffed. There was no way they were going to be able to achieve success. And then the Ukrainians achieved landmark successes. And the failure of the summer 2023 counteroffensive for Ukraine, I think, just reinforced this sense of inflated overconfidence. And that's what we saw happening in Kursk. There was really no way in which I think Putin or any of his inner circle really believed that the Ukrainians could actually act on what they were saying. The Ukrainians have been saying that they want to bring the war to Russia, to make the Russians feel the consequence of what they're doing to Ukrainian civilians every day. I don't think that Putin and his inner circle ever believed that the Ukrainians would be able to do that.
What do you think explains, Samuel, the slowness of the Russian response? Because if you're going to launch an effective counterattack, it helps if you launch that counterattack quickly. But here we are 2 weeks on, and there's no particular sign of Russia pushing back against the territory that's been taken by Ukraine.
Well, because I think that there's a lot of issues associated with how Russia can actually respond to this quite effectively. The Ukrainians are coming in not with a bunch of untrained forces, but with some of their seasoned commanders. Some of the commanders who are fighting in Kursk are people who were fighting for territorial defense battalions as early as 2014. So they have a lot of experience on the ground. They have NATO-class infrastructure along with them. They have HIMARS systems that can destroy, as we've seen now, 3 bridges in the Kursk region. So this is not an inexperienced bunch, and it looks as if the Russians were claiming that 300 Ukrainians enter. It probably was closer to 2,000, and it could be as much as 15,000 that the Ukrainians may be able to hold in that area. So the Ukrainians have come with a large number of troops, and they cannot really be dislodged easily. So this leaves Russia with a quandary as to how it can respond, because the only people that it had on its borders were untrained conscripts who were easily overrun. Some of the conscripts on the borders didn't even have guns, and they were fighting against people with NATO-class equipment and seasoned military professionals. So it was obviously a state of total chaos. So the Russians have got 3 choices now. They either withdraw forces from Kherson and Zaporizhia, which is what they've been doing, according to some Ukrainian military sources last week, because they don't believe the Ukrainians can cross the river in Dnipro and take over that other bank of Kherson very easily. The fortifications in Zaporizhia are so strong that even a drawdown of manpower will still make it very hard for the Ukrainians to cut through all those mines and trenches, as we saw last summer. That's probably what they're doing right now. They're sending Rosgvardia into the mix also to try to strengthen and shore up and stymie the Ukrainian advance. And they're sending more conscripts onto the front lines. But that doesn't seem to be enough to stop Ukraine's advances, because Ukraine, even after some of those things were done, was able to take over Suzhia and was able to destroy the bridges and move further. So now the Russians face an even more uncomfortable quandary. They have to withdraw some forces from Donetsk, where they're right on the cusp of achieving a success in Pokrovsk, and they're right on the cusp of achieving a success in Chasiv Yar, which will allow them to push into the Donetsk major cities finally, after all that sacrifice in Bakhmut. They have to blow their advantage there and defend their homeland, or they have to call effectively a much larger mobilization, effectively something resembling a general mobilization. But to even give those new conscripts a minimal amount of training, it means the Ukrainian forces are probably going to be stuck in Russia for at least a month or 2.
Yeah, and of course, a big mobilization push carries with it political risks as well. I mean, of those options, Samuel, which do you think is the most likely we'll see from Russia?
Well, I think that the Russians are actually picking none of the above, and they're taking a very high risk strategy. They're hoping that they can make some much faster than expensive gains in Donetsk after Pokrovsk falls, and then force the Ukrainians to go back and withdraw the troops from Kursk and defend their homeland. It's true that the Russians are making incremental gains in the Pokrovsk area, and there have been evacuations now. The Ukrainians are saying they have to leave within 2 weeks in a town of 53,000 people. It's possible that area will fall, and Russia will get a significant logistical advantage. But Russia does not have a history, aside from Mariupol, of taking over large cities inside Ukraine with any degree of pace. So moving on to Sloviansk and Kramatorsk is going to be a long slog. I think the Russians believe that they can carry out some kind of a surprise blitz in Donetsk and force the Ukrainians to withdraw, and that's their strategy right now. But I don't think that that's necessarily that feasible. So I think the Russians will have to go back to those 2 very unpalatable choices: surrender your momentum in eastern Ukraine, or start mobilizing a lot more people.
Sounds like you're saying the Russians are still in denial.
I think the Russians are still in denial. They're still scrambling on how to adjust, and they're still also scrambling on how to adjust in a way that promotes a sense of normalcy at home, especially after the initial propaganda was that this is nothing much to worry about. So the Russian telegram channels, when they first said there was nothing much to worry about, were kind of being a bit guarded, but critical in their own way. They were like saying the Russians have finally sent Rosguardia and regular forces. They would, how many times do you use the word finally in one paragraph to make that point, right? That was, I think, Oleg Saryev who made that kind of post. And others were kind of urging, saying the situation was very grave. And that was like their way of criticizing it. I think that if the situation lasts longer, being in denial and trying to promote a mood of normalcy is not going to satisfy the clued-in ultranationalist bloggers who populate the Telegram space.
You mentioned the bridges a moment ago, Samuel. I wanted to ask you about that because Ukraine has now destroyed the third and final bridge linking the occupied part of the Kursk region to the rest of the oblast. How significant is that? And I mean, you've got Russia playing it down almost, saying, look, we've been able to establish pontoons, so it doesn't really matter. Again, is that Russia being in denial, or how would you evaluate the significance of dropping those bridges?
Well, I think it's very significant. I think it's also, again, the risk of Russia being in denial, because how many times did the Russians talk about their pontoon ferries and their temporary crossings in Kherson in the months leading up to the collapse of Kherson in November of 2022, right? From August to November 2022, that was exactly what they were talking about. All these kind of pontoons and ferries and alternative supply routes to replace the bridges. But once the Ukrainians got the Antonovsky Bridge, there was not much the Russians could do. So I think that this is looking like a repeat of the military failures that we saw in Kherson with regards to the bridges, and the initial Ukrainian incursion into Kursk is looking a lot like the undermanned positions in Kharkiv that had to flee in September of 2022. So this setback in Kursk is reminding the Russians, even if they don't want to admit it, of their two most humiliating defeats of this war: that withdrawal from Kherson and that withdrawal from Kharkiv.
Wanted to get your thoughts as well, Samuel, on a conversation we were having on yesterday's episode of Frontline with the former British Army Colonel, now military analyst Hamish De Bretton-Gordon, and he was saying he thinks it's feasible that we will see Ukraine launch further cross-border attacks into Russia in the coming weeks and months, given the success of the Kursk incursion. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think it's very possible. I think that there was some reporting yesterday, and The Economist picked up on it, that Kursk was not the only region where the Ukrainians thought that they could make an advance. The Ukrainians were also looking quite seriously at Bryansk. Bryansk was an area where they were shelling even in middle of 2022. And that was one of the first regions, actually, of Russia where the Ukrainians actually struck and tried to bring the war to the Russians, right? So there's a possibility that they could do something in Bryansk. There's a possibility that they could do something in Belgorod. I have a feeling that the Russians were most prepared for the Belgorod scenario, which is why there have been so many evacuations and sealing off of territory as unsafe. They figured that Belgorod would be the natural antidote to striking Kharkiv, whereas Kursk would be the natural antidote to striking Sumy. They'd done more damage to Kharkiv, so they expected more from Belgorod. But I think that if the Ukrainians go somewhere else, they will trick the Russians again and hit Bryansk rather than hit Belgorod again.
Of course, we don't know at this stage what Ukraine's primary objective with the Kursk incursion is, so we can only speculate, I suppose. Originally, I thought, well, it's designed to divert troops away from the front line in the east of Ukraine into Kursk region, regain the initiative. Increasingly, and I don't know whether you agree with this, Samuel, my sense is maybe this actually was designed as a message to the West to say, look, if we take the fight to Russia, A, we can win, and B, your fears of some kind of retaliation, some drastic retaliation, potentially using tactical nuclear weapons by Putin, those fears are unfounded. What is your sense of things?
I think I absolutely agree with what you're just saying right now. I think that the Western perception was very much that Ukraine was going to try to drain out Russia's manpower. And it's true that the Russians may have to divert manpower from Donetsk over there. But as I've just been saying, that's the option that they're going to have to go as an undesirable, maybe lesser evil choice or greater conscription. And it's not something that's going to happen immediately, as we're seeing, right? So it's only it's something that could happen, but it's not something that will happen immediately. I think that the Ukrainians are aware that the Russians have a lot of cannon fodder that they can throw on the front lines still. So what they're trying to do is trying to convince the West that the fight is worth supporting after the failed counteroffensive last summer and the slowdown in congressional aid that we saw in the first half of this year. They really want to show, regardless of who gets into the White House in November, whether it be Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, especially I think Trump, that this is a war that's worth fighting and continuing to support. They want to strengthen their position in future negotiations, whether that be a temporary Kursk for Kharkiv land swap, or whether that be occupying more Russian territory and pushing for something more substantive in a final settlement negotiation. I think that's also something that they're trying to do. And more importantly, they're trying to blow this idea of escalation risks with Russia and trying to get people to stop thinking about this because Russia really can't escalate that much more than they're already doing. I think that's what the Ukrainians want to send a message to. They can kill more Ukrainian civilians, but they're unlikely to use nuclear weapons. And that's why the Germans should move ahead with the Taurus cruise missiles. The Americans should send more cruise missiles. The Americans should give permission for long-range strikes all across Russia, not just across the borders. And the British should really come up with a more firm and consistent policy on the storm shadows. So I think that that's what the Ukrainians want in the short term.
Do you see any sign of that, though, Samuel? Do you see any sign of Ukraine's Western allies moving on those restrictions?
Well, I think that there will be signs. I think as the offensive goes on, I think it's a little bit too early to say. I think Keir Starmer certainly has basically alluded to the fact that the storm shadows can be used more extensively, and I think that could be a step. And really, as we noted, all it takes is one major ally to make a big decision, and the others usually tend to fall in line, right? So when France and the Dutch and some others broke the taboo on striking Russia, period, we even saw Olaf Scholz, known for his caution, go along with the use of German weapons, and German weapons have been used in this Kursk offensive, and there hasn't been any criticism from Germany about that. When the Germans were holding their back on the tanks, the Americans promised the Abrams, and look what happened. The Leopards came, right? So all it takes is one or two allies to set the trend and to move all the others in line, and I suspect that we will see more than one or two allies doing that in the weeks to come.